Welcome to the Spiritual Mentoring Group. Today is June 16th, 2017. And this week's Parsha is really interesting because we have a double Parsha. It is Matot and Maaseh. Now, when we read a double Parsha, generally speaking, the Haftorah reading, which remember is the reading from the prophets or the writings that accompanies the Parsha, right? Unless it's Rosh Chodesh, which is the beginning of the month, when we read the special Rosh Chodesh Haftorah. Otherwise, we normally read, when there's a double Parsha, we read the Haftorah for the second Parsha. So it makes sense that this week is Matot Maaseh, and Matot Maaseh. And so this week, the Haftorah portion that we read will be the Haftorah portion for Maaseh. But Matot and Maaseh are not always joined together, not every year, because it all depends on how things fall. Last week, we read Parshat Pinchas, right? Which happens to be the same name as my husband's name. And he chose, because he's a convert, he was able to choose his name, and he chose that name because he identified with the character of Pinchas, who was very righteous for Hashem, didn't necessarily think about what the consequences might be of his actions, but he was righteous for Hashem, and my husband is very much like that. So anyway, so last week we read Parshat Pinchas, but the Haftorah for Parshat Pinchas was not read. Instead, we read the Haftorah for Matot. Why? Well, because the Haftorahs for Matot, Maaseh, and Devarim, which is the two that we're going to read this week and next week's, those three Haftorahs were not chosen to match the Torah portion. If you remember, all of the Haftorahs up until this week, or last week, depending on how things fall during the year, are chosen to match the Torah portion, because back in the times when the Greeks were occupying Israel, they were threatened by the idea of this Jewish law, because as the Greek occupiers, there's only one law, and that's the Greek law. And so they outlawed the Jews reading the Torah portion each week. But they weren't as threatened by the reading of the prophets and the writings. And so during that time, the leaders of Israel chose pieces from the prophets and the writings that matched in some way the content of the Torah portion. So, you know, a lot of times we'll see that in the Torah portion it's talking about the building of the tabernacle. So the Haftorah is about the building of the temple, or, you know, different things like that, where they match, so that if you can't read the Torah portion, you can know the basic content of the Torah portion by reading the Haftorah, which is what happened during the time of the Greek occupation, which was a few hundred years before the destruction of the Second Temple. And the last 10 weeks of the Jewish year, basically from the 17th of Tammuz, which was this last week, up until Rosh Hashanah, those 10 weeks have their own unique Haftorahs that have nothing to do with the Parsha, all right? The three, which is last week, this week, and next week, are called the three Haftorahs of calamity, which I'll go over again in just a minute. And then the 7 that follow Tisha B'Av, which I'll talk about in just a second. Then the 7 from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah are called the Haftorahs of consolation. Okay, so they were chosen because the content, the 3 of calamity, were chosen because the content is very appropriate for this 3-week period. Okay, from the 17th of Tammuz, which was last week when we had the fast, until Tisha B'Av, which is now 2 weeks away, we have something we call the 3 weeks. It's 3 weeks from the fast of Tammuz to the fast of Tisha B'Av. And, excuse me, on the 17th of Tammuz, we actually commemorate 5 great catastrophes which occurred in Jewish history, which is why it's a fast day. Okay, hang on. Hopefully you can see the screen. If you can't see the screen, unmute and let me know. But if you can see it, just don't worry about it. Okay. The 17th of Tammuz, we commemorate 5 calamities or catastrophes that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. So the first one is this is the date that our tradition tells us that Moshe broke the tablets that contained the 10 Commandments on Har Sinai. And this was in response to the sin of the golden calf. And it kind of became like a bruise on the calendar, if you will. Like, for some reason, this date, as well as Tisha B'Av, which we'll see in a few minutes, became a bad day for the Jewish people throughout history. And really the time between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av is considered a really bad period of time. And so, for example, during these 3 weeks, we don't listen to live music. And many people don't listen to any music that has instruments. Like what I just played for you at the very beginning. They might listen to a cappella music, but they wouldn't listen to music with instruments. And there are no live concerts. There are no weddings during this time. I'm pretty sure that most parties and simchas, unless it's something that you can't put off, like a bar mitzvah probably would happen during this time. And a bris, of course, would happen during this time because those are time dependent. But anything that can be put off is put off. We basically have no public celebrations during these 3 weeks. Like I said, nobody gets married during these 3 weeks. And it's considered a time of partial mourning until Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, which is in a few days from now, which is 9 days before Tisha B'Av. And starting at Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, Rosh Chodesh Av, for those 9 days until Tisha B'Av, Ashkenazi Jews do not eat meat during those 9 days. We also don't do laundry unless it's absolutely necessary, for hygiene. People who have babies are allowed to wash the baby's clothes and whatever. But we're not supposed to wear newly laundered clothes, and we're not supposed to buy new clothes. We're not supposed to wear new clothes during this time. It's a partial time of mourning. And as you can see on the screen, it's just like so many bad things have happened to the Jewish people throughout history during this period of time. And in fact, many Jews during the 9 days, especially in Israel, they won't sign a rental contract. I mean, there was one year we had to move, and we were moving like immediately after Tisha B'Av. And the new landlords said, look, you have our word. We're not going to sign a contract with you during the 9 days, but I promise you we'll sit down and we'll sign it immediately after Tisha B'Av is over. You have our word, trust us. And we did, and everything worked out just fine. But they didn't want to sign a contract during the 9 days because of this history of bad things happening for the Jewish people during this time. So it's very interesting to see how it plays out in Israeli culture, for example, even among people who are not particularly observant, because it's kind of been drilled into us for thousands of years what a bad time of year this is for us. And I'm not superstitious, but, you can't get away from the fact that this is what happened. So we should use this time as a time to meditate on the things that we do that contribute to the sins of the Jewish people, and to try to find ways that we can work towards bringing the Mashiach and rectifying these things that we've done. So number 2 is that during the times of the first temple on the 17th of Tammuz, the daily offerings had to be suspended because of the Babylonian siege on Jerusalem. Because of the siege, the Kohanim could no longer offer animals. They couldn't obtain animals, so they couldn't do the offerings anymore. And the siege resulted in the destruction of the first temple on the 9th of Av, 3 weeks later. So the Babylonians actually, I think, the siege began like on the 8th of Tammuz, but it was on the 17th that there were no longer enough animals for them to be able to sacrifice kosher animals at the temple. So the sacrifices stopped on the 17th. So from what I understand, the fast of the 17th originally was observed like on the 8th or something like that, but then after all of these other things happened, it was moved to the 17th. So the 9th of Av in Hebrew, by the way, is Tisha B'Av, just to make sure that you understand it's the 9th. Tisha is the number 9 in Hebrew. Tisha B'Av is the most solemn day of the Jewish calendar. A lot of people mistakenly think that Yom Kippur is a day of mourning. It's not. Even though it's a fast day and it's a day of atonement, it's not a day of mourning in the same way that Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning. Okay, so Tisha B'Av is the most solemn day of the calendar year. And if you remember, when I'm done with this section, you can ask me about, well, next week I'll talk about all of the prohibitions of Tisha B'Av for you, so that you can go into Tisha B'Av prepared and ready, knowing what it's about and what you need to do or not do. All right, so number 3 is on this same date, 490 years later, Jerusalem's walls were again breached. This time it was by the Romans, and that led to the destruction of the second temple on Tisha B'Av. Okay, and it's interesting because if you do some research, like if you go to Wikipedia and you try to look up the amount of time between the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple, you will find discrepancies in the dating. And the reason for this, and I didn't find this out until I was teaching my counter-missionary seminar, and I was teaching on the book of Daniel, and I was trying to reconcile the times and the dates and stuff, and I was having trouble because there's a period of about 160 years, 165, something like that, where all of a sudden the Jewish calendar and the secular calendar don't match up. It's like there's 165 years missing. And the reason for this is that most of the world did not keep good track of dates and things like that. There's a story that's told, and I probably have shared it with you, about the fact that Martha Washington and George Washington, which was, George Washington was the first president of the United States, and according to the dates of their birthdays, George Washington was older than Martha Washington. But in reality, Martha Washington was older than George because he was born in England and she was born in France or something like that, and they were on 2 different calendars. So the date-wise, her birthday is after his, but she's actually older than him. So throughout history, people have been notoriously bad about keeping track of the dates. And so there's a discrepancy. But according to the Jewish records, the first temple was destroyed 490 years before the second temple was destroyed. And so the second temple stood for 420 years because there was a 70-year gap between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple. And if you read the book of Daniel, you understand, and I think I actually touch on it again a little bit later, but anyway, it doesn't matter. on this date, 490 years later, excuse me, Jerusalem's walls were again breached, this time by the Roman army, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple on Tisha B'Av. Number 4, prior to the Great Revolt, which was in 66 CE, so it was like 8 years after the destruction, or I guess 6 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Roman general Apostamos burned a Torah scroll, okay? And this particular act set a precedent for the burning of Jewish books by enemies of the Jewish people throughout the centuries, right? We know that during the Inquisition and all of these things, you know, we actually lost, I don't know if you're aware of this, I know that there are whole tractates of the Talmud that have been destroyed. I'm not sure about the Mishnah, but definitely the Gemara. And there are actually references to books of the Gemara in other books of the Gemara that we don't have. Now, some have been recovered, like there was only a couple of existing copies left in the world and they were found at some point, but many of them were not, and they were totally destroyed, because part of the way that you can dehumanize a group of people is by destroying their holy writings, right? And so the idea of burning books has actually become symbolic of the, if not dehumanizing, certainly the devaluing of a particular group of people. And so on the 17th of Tammuz in 66 CE, this Torah scroll was burned, and that set a precedence for the burning of Jewish books throughout the rest of history. Number 5, also according to our tradition, it was on this date that an idolatrous image was placed in the sanctuary of the Holy Temple, which of course caused its desecration. Okay, now on Tisha B'Av, which is 3 weeks after the 17th of Tammuz, basically 2 weeks from today. I can't remember which day we actually fasted last week. It might have been Monday, not Sunday. I can't remember now. So on Tisha B'Av, which is 2 weeks from this class approximately, and I have to look at the date, because if our class actually falls on Tisha B'Av, I'm going to have to postpone the class. But it was on the 9th of Av in 1313 BCE. So this is before, 1,000 years before the destruction of the temple, or of the Second Temple, that the spies returned from their exploration of the land of Israel, right? We read about that a month ago or so, right? Moses sends the 12 spies to check out the land of Israel, and they come back, and 2 of them give a positive report and 10 of them give a negative report. It was actually the 8th of Av that they returned, but it was on the 9th of Av that the children of Israel believed the report and began to cry and insisted that they'd rather go back to Egypt than chance being slaughtered by the Canaanites. Of course, this resulted in those who were alive at the time, at least the males 20 years and up, who were alive at the time, being condemned to die in the wilderness and not to enter the promised land, leaving only their children to enter the promised land 38 years later. Okay? And we just read in Parshat Pinchas, where it tells us that the last of the people who were alive at that time had passed away. So now, where we are in the Parshas, the Jewish people are, about to enter the land at any time now. Now we know next week we start the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim. So we know that we have that whole book to finish before we actually enter the land. But the book only covers about 1.5 years. We covered 38 years in a couple of parshas, which is kind of interesting. But so that happened on Tisha B'Av. Also, number 2, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians on the 9th of Av. Number 3, on the same date, 490 years later, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans, and it continued actually burning until the 10th. So it's really interesting, like, we don't eat meat on the 9th of Av. Well, we don't eat anything on the 9th of Av, but most people will not eat meat until midday. I mean, a lot of people don't eat meat for breakfast anyway, but will not eat meat until midday on the 10th, just because of the fact that the temple actually burned for, it was 2 days, not just 1 day. So they kind of extend it. And then number 4, there was a brutal battle in the town of Beitar, which is actually very close to where I live. On that day, approximately 73 years later, during what's known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans. I'm sorry I'm giving you so many dates and historical facts. Usually I try to make our lesson a little bit more spiritual, but I think it's important for us to understand so that we can understand what this period is about and where we should focus during these 3 weeks, okay? So we see on Tisha B'Av, the spies brought back a negative report. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans. Beitar, the rebels, the Jewish rebels, were brutally butchered during that battle. And 1 year later, the Romans completely plowed over the Holy Temple, burying it. So it was also on Tisha B'Av 1 year later. And of course, the remains are still buried to this day. We've excavated some of them, but many of them are still buried. And one more point, in modern-ish times, if you will, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290. I think I forgot to put that on the slide. I'm sorry about that. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290 on Tisha B'Av, and in 1492, Tisha B'Av was the date by which all the Jews had to leave Spain. So, and then the last one, which is a little bit more modern, apparently the beginning of World War I occurred on Tisha B'Av when the Germans declared war on Russia. And many believe that even though there was a break, that that World War I really, it never really stopped. It just had a break. But World War II was really just a continuation of World War I. And of course, we know World War II was the Holocaust. So the beginning of World War I was the beginning of this really terrible period of time also for the Jewish people. So the 3 weeks between Tisha B'Av, the 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av are considered this period of mourning. So during this time, our Haftorah, rather than, well, I said this already, but rather than relating to the Torah portion for those 3 weeks, come from selections of the prophets that are called the 3 Haftorahs of calamity. That's what they're called. So the first Haftorah, which is read, which is the Haftorah for Matot, but because Matot and Maaseh are combined this year, we read it as part of Parshat Pinchas. That comes from Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. All right? That's the Haftorah for Parshat Matot. But when Matot and Maaseh are combined, which happens when Parshat Pinchas falls after the 17th of Tammuz, which is what happened this year. The 17th of Tammuz was last week, and Shabbat, 2 days ago, or yesterday, was Parshat Pinchas. So when that happens, then the Haftorah for Matot is read as right after Parshat Pinchas. And the Haftorah for Maaseh, which is from Yirmiyahu, chapter 2, verse 4 through chapter 2 through verse 28, is read read this week. So we combine the Torah portion, Matot and Maaseh, but we read the Haftorah for Maaseh. And then next week, which is the Shabbat immediately preceding Tisha B'Av, and it always works out. This is why sometimes Matot and Maaseh are combined, and sometimes Matot and Maaseh are not. It's to make sure that Devarim is always read the Shabbat immediately preceding Tisha B'Av. And the Haftorah for Devarim is found in Isaiah, Yeshayahu, chapter 1, verses 1 through 27. Now, it's interesting because this Shabbat is called, the Shabbat of Devarim, which will be next Shabbat, is called Shabbat Chazon. Now, Chazon means a vision, right? And the reason that it's called Shabbat Chazon is that this vision is supposed to inspire a change in us that is so fundamental that we will turn this vision of the third temple into an actual physical reality. In other words, we're supposed to take this to heart to such a degree that we as a people will take action to try to rectify the sin that brought down the temples and merit, God willing, the coming of the Mashiach and the building of the third temple. So looking ahead just a little, like I started to say earlier, these three readings are not the only ones that don't correspond to the Torah portion. It's actually a total of 10 from the 17th of Tammuz until Rosh Hashanah that we have these special Haftorahs, right? So the first three, as I just mentioned, have to do with the destruction of the temples. And then the next 7 are called the 7 weeks of consolation, all right? And these are Haftorahs that kind of remind us of the promises that Hashem has given us, that even though we sinned and even though we are reaping the punishment for those sins, you know, whether it's being kicked out of the land or being persecuted by the rest of the world, that in the end, everything will be made right, that Mashiach will come, that the temple will be rebuilt, that the Jewish people will be restored to their position of respect and influence in the world. And, you know, the world will become supernaturally at peace, and, you know, all of the things that come along with that vision of the third temple and the time of the Mashiach. So those 7 weeks are called the 7 weeks of consolation, and they bring us up to Rosh Hashanah, which of course Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of the creation of the world, as well as Judgment Day of the world. Now it's interesting because Yom Kippur is not Judgment Day. Yom Kippur is atonement, is the Day of Atonement. Rosh Hashanah is the Day of Judgment. The whole world is judged on Rosh Hashanah. On Yom Kippur, which is 10 days later, we spend the entire day repenting and asking God to forgive us and to judge us positively, because the books, if you will, of judgment are left open for that period of time. And so it's almost like Rosh Hashanah is the judgment day of the world, and Yom Kippur is the judgment day of the Jewish people. And after we have done our Day of Atonement, that's when everything is sealed in the books. Although according to the rabbis, the books aren't actually closed until Sukkot. So, you know, it's kind of this period of judgment and repentance that we go through at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But it's during this time that we're supposed to try to prepare ourselves to make things right so that we can see the temple rebuilt and the coming of the Mashiach. And the fact that we're reading these 7 Haftorah portions that contain this promise are supposed to help inspire us to really get a hold of this vision and to want to make the changes in our life that will hopefully tip the balance in our favor, and that this year, this coming year, we will merit to see the coming of the Mashiach. Now, this week's portion, Parsha, Matot Maaseh, begins with an entire chapter speaking about the importance of keeping one's vows. That's the first chapter. Now, granted, there are 7 aliyahs, and this is really just the first aliyah, but it's so, so important. It begins with this entire chapter speaking about the importance of keeping one's vows and the rules concerning a husband or a father and his ability to cancel a woman's vows. Now, a lot of people have a fundamental problem with the idea that a woman's vows can be nullified by her husband, or if she's never been married, by her father. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why this actually makes sense based on how women and men think and how we are, we're very driven by our passions, and sometimes we will make irrational vows. And so anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but it does actually make sense. I'm not going to go there right now, because what I want to look at today is the idea of the power of our words and why this passage is even necessary. All right, we know that man was created in the image of God, right? That's from the very beginning of the Torah in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And we know from the first couple of chapters of the Torah that God is a creative God, right? God creates the world. He creates everything in it. First, he creates the universe and the structure for the world to be a part of. God is a creative God. And in fact, this is our introduction to Hashem. All right? He is powerful and he is creative, and he created the universe out of nothing but his words, right? So from this, since the Torah says that this is who God is, and it says that man was made in God's image, so we can understand that we as people are also creative and that our words are powerful. Now, it's true, we're limited by physicality, right, as to what we can create, but still our words create reality. We already talked about the 3 weeks, but it's interesting to note that the sages explain that the reason for the destruction of the second temple is something that's called sinat chinam, which means baseless hatred. It's said that the people didn't respect each other. Now, if you think about it, how do you know if someone respects someone else? Mostly it's by how they speak about that person to others, right? Our speech is the main facilitator of this baseless hatred. Therefore, it is speech which was the primary vehicle for the destruction of the second temple. So the destruction of the first temple is usually attributed to idolatry, but it's also considered a temporary destruction, as we'll see in a few minutes. So here we learn in Matot, the parsha about vows. In Hebrew, nedarim. Nedar is a vow. Nedarim is the plural. We learn that our words not only create reality, but that they are binding and that they can bestow a status of holiness, of kedusha, on an object. But our words not only have the power to transform the mundane into the holy, they also have the ability to transform the permissible into the forbidden. This is a really powerful gift that can be used to do a tremendous amount of good in the world, or it could also be used for harm. Had we used our gift to bestow the status of holiness or kedusha upon our fellow Jews in the time of the Second Temple, we would have had a very different outcome. But instead, we chose to use our powerful gift to bestow upon our fellow Jews a status of loathing and hatred. And as a result, we lost our ability to have that same intimate connection with God that we had previously enjoyed. The truth is that we actually lost this intimacy at the destruction of the first temple. But we understand when we read Daniel, the book of Daniel, especially chapter 9, that the second temple was given to us as a second opportunity to set things right with God. And that had we done so, we would have seen an end to sin and the establishment of everlasting righteousness. That's what it says right in Daniel chapter 9. Instead, we failed to take advantage of the second chance we were being offered, and we used this one part of who we are that most resembles God, our ability to speak, our tongues, as the instrument with which we can create or destroy, and we used it to destroy each other instead of creating heaven on earth. So even in just everyday ordinary speech, we really need to be aware of this fact. This Torah portion is talking about making vows, and it has to do with the fact that when we say something, even in casual speech, we create reality. And when we do not do the thing that we said we would do, we create a dissonance in our life, and that dissonance must give expression somehow. Everything we say creates something. So oftentimes this results in negative consequences in our own life, but it can also affect the lives of those around us, especially our family members. So it's vitally important that we remember that what we say creates reality, that this reality can be positive or negative, and that if we create something that we do not carry through, in other words, if I say I'm going to do something and then I don't do it, we create this friction, this dissonance that has to give expression somehow in our lives and in the lives of those we touch. So we see in the Parsha that a person can make a vow not to do something. And that action of declaring that they're not going to do that makes it a binding prohibition on them at the same level of a Torah prohibition. Breaking a vow is a very, very big deal, right? So example, if a person was to declare that they're never going to drink coffee again, let's say, and what happens is when they make that vow, basically that coffee becomes forbidden to them, just like pork. It is at that level. They are not allowed to drink it, all right? And unless the vow is annulled through proper channels, coffee becomes unkosher, treif for that person, all right? So we can see how making a vow can turn something that is unpermissible, that is permissible, unpermissible, forbidden at the same level of the things that God told us were forbidden directly. Similarly, we can see that this is why the rabbis throughout the ages were able to make fences around the Torah for the Jewish people, and they're considered binding on the Jewish people at the same level of Torah itself. I know that a lot of people are confused about this idea. I mean, how is it that, the rabbis can make these laws that are just as binding as Torah laws, especially when the Torah says we're not to add to it? How can the rabbis make these fences around the Torah? Isn't that adding to the Torah? Well, if you look at this as the leaders of the Jewish people making a vow on behalf of the people, then it makes much more sense, right? And at the time, those vows were accepted by the people, right? So our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers made a vow that we are still obliged to follow, if you will, because a vow changes reality, and it can take something that's permissible and make it unpermissible. And yet it's clear, right, from the Torah, it's clear that vows are permissible. I mean, we have this whole chapter saying that if you make a vow and, how you're supposed to follow through. Okay, so unless these vows, which were made on behalf of the nation and not dissolved by the nation as a whole, are dissolved through proper channels, they remain binding. And this, of course, demonstrates another reason why we have to be careful with our speech. We see in Mishle, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 3, it says, "He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction." Our words are the conduit for spiritual power in this world. Our words literally are the combination lock that allows us to access the spiritual realm. And so we need to be so very careful to use them only to unlock good and not to create evil. So why were we created? Right? We were created to have a relationship with God and to bring perfection down into the imperfect, right? Our purpose, our overarching purpose in this world is to bring God's presence into the world, because it's only in learning to do this, to perfect the imperfect, that we can truly appreciate the perfect. How can we exist in the realm of clarity if we don't first understand what it means to be without that clarity, right? Which is the world that we live in right now. We live in a world which is very unclear. It's a world of concealment, all right? And how do we bring this perfection into the world? How do we create this conduit for God's presence to come into the world? Through our speech, right? Through speaking the praises of Hashem, we create the reality of his presence in this world. We bring God's presence down into this world. So God speaks us and the entire universe into existence, but not just once. It's not like God created us and then that was the end. He continues to speak us into existence by supplying our life force. If we are to truly express our reflection of God, then we also must give life. God gives life to us and to the rest of the world, and to be an emulation or a reflection of who God is, we also must continually give life, to speak good into this world. That way we can correct that sin of baseless hatred that resulted in the destruction of the temple. And the way that we can do this is by being mindful of our speech and trying to only speak good in this world. When we speak good, like I said, we're creating this conduit between this world and the spiritual realm, and we're drawing God's presence into this world and undoing, to a small degree, the lack of presence that was created. That was interesting. I just had something fall off the shelf. All right. So what I was saying was that we can rectify that sin of sinat chinam, of baseless hatred, that resulted in the destruction of the temple, by being mindful of our speech and only speaking good into this world. And that when we speak good, we're creating this conduit between this world and the spiritual realm, and we're drawing God's presence into this world, kind of undoing, to a small degree, the lack of presence that the destruction of the temple created, right? We spoke badly against each other, causing the destruction of the temple, which means that we lost a certain level of intimacy in God's presence in this world. And when we speak God's praises and we speak good and we speak life to other people, then we draw God's presence back down into this world. And so in some ways, our speech becomes like another temple, or at least like the sacrifices in the temple, right? So have you ever noticed that one comment can actually change a person's life? I mean, think about the things that people have said to you, either positive or negative, that have actually changed the course of your life. It may have been as simple as sorry, as simple as telling you you're beautiful or smart, or God forbid the opposite, right? We have to learn to use our gift of speech to build people up, to build worlds. Everything that comes out of our mouth must be truth. Falsehood causes dissonance. It causes friction in this world. And we want harmony. We don't want friction. So the key of this parsha is that whatever you say, you need to do. So we need to think before we speak. All right? It's really, really important. The three causes of friction in this world are speaking negatively, speaking lies, and speaking a reality that we don't fulfill. Okay? And there are examples of speech doing this, accomplishing this power. Like, for example, the Nazirite vow, right? When a Nazir takes a vow through his speech, things that were permitted to him a moment before are no longer permitted to him, right? We remember a few weeks ago, Miriam spoke Lashon Hara against Moshe, and she was punished because of that. The spies who entered the nation of Israel to dwell ended up, causing the Jewish people to dwell in the desert for 40 years because of their speech. Moshe, who in the last parsha was, or two parshas ago, was told to speak to a rock, and instead of speaking to it, he hit it, right? So because he didn't speak when he was supposed to, he caused his own failure to enter the land. And then last week, we also saw, or 2 weeks ago, we saw that Bilam, who was a prophet, he tried to curse the Jewish people instead of blessing them. And the Ramban, that's Nachmanides, in his letter, he wrote this famous letter, it was to his son, but we all learn it. He said that before you say anything, think, is this worth saying or not? Do you know how many times I've wanted to respond to something on Facebook, for example, and I start typing and I start typing, and then I stop and I look at it and I say, okay, is it really worth it? Should I send this or not? And many times I end up just deleting it because it's really not that valuable. The destruction of the Holy Temple caused the presence of God to be moved farther from us. And yet we are told to seek Hashem while he may be found, right? We're told that during the month of Elul, which follows Av, right? We're about to come into the month of Av. The next month is Elul. All right, and then the following month is Tishrei, which is when Rosh Hashanah comes. But we're told that during the month of Elul, which is only 9 weeks away now, Hashem is closest to us. So by heeding the message of this parsha and understanding the power that is present in our speech and our ability to use it to bring God nearer, we can ensure that he is accessible during the months of Elul and Tishrei, and we can repair our relationship with him and ready the world for redemption. So this year, please God, may it be the year that we see the Mashiach and the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple. Okay, so I'm going to give you an opportunity if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question before I go on to the bracha that I'm going to share with you. We've got about 5 minutes, a few more minutes, and I've just got the one bracha that I want to talk about. But before we do that, does anybody have a comment? Rivka, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay. This is something that I learned in a history class that I was taking, and it goes back to when the Jews were expelled from Spain.
Mm-hmm.
All of their belongings were taken by the court. Their wealth was stolen from them, and it was that money that money was used for Christopher Columbus when he was expelled. Like he wasn't expelled, I'm sorry, but that money that was stolen from us was used to finance Christopher Columbus's trip to the Americas, and he had several people on on the ships with him that were Jews.
Yeah, from what I
And
understand, it was mostly Jews. It was those
yeah, it
last
was,
Jews that had to get out.
yeah, because he didn't agree with what the court was doing. And so, yeah, it was mostly Jews, and that's how we got here to the Americas.
Right,
That's
right.
all I wanted to add.
Great, thank you. It's good to see you back with us.
Yes, sorry, I've been going through a lot lately.
You should share with the group. You know, the ladies in our group are very caring and they care about you. You know, we kind of have gotten a
Yeah,
relationship going. So, you know, on the Facebook group, if you need prayer, if you need people to be there for you, just let everybody know, okay?
yeah, I will do that. I was actually going to post something. I'm going through a lot of medical testing right now.
Mm,
Um, I'm being tested for narcolepsy. It
mm.
looks like I've developed narcolepsy because I'm having these episodes where I'll be talking to my kids or my husband, and then I will start dreaming,
Wow.
and then I start talking to them what I'm dreaming about. And then other times I just, when I'm walking or something, like my legs will just give out on me, and then it'll start the dreaming too. And so that's cataplexy, and that's also part of narcolepsy. So I
Wow.
could really use some prayer about that.
Definitely.
Yeah, the treatment medications are, you know, not something that I would ever want to take.
Mm,
So yeah.
that's tough. That's really tough. Anytime that you have a medical condition where the you know, the treatment, it helps some of your symptoms, but you know, not, but then it creates new problems of its own. That's not pleasant at all.
Yeah, the treatment is the GHB, which is, you know, the street name for it is the date rape drug.
Oh, wow.
And you take it, you have to take it when you're already in bed because it starts working within like 2 minutes.
Wow.
And then you have to get up 4.5 hours later and take a second dose. And so I guess the theory behind that is if you're getting really deep sleep from that drug, then you have less episodes during the day where you're falling asleep or you're talking to somebody. But just the idea of taking that, just you know.
Yeah. Okay, you need to let me know if you want me to edit out your sharing this, just because I don't know who in the future will be watching this video. I mean, it's only people who are members, but
Hmm.
you need to let me know. You can tell me privately whether you want the recording to include it or not. But thank you for sharing with us. That way we know better how to pray for you.
Yeah, thank you for being there for me, guys. I get a lot out of this group.
We get a lot out of having you here. Okay, so we're going to continue now. We're going to move on to one. We're just going to do one morning bracha because we're running out of time. But the bracha that we're going to look at today says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam she'asa li kol tzarki, which means, blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has provided me with all my needs. And of course, you know, I could write an entire book on this topic. And we've already talked quite a lot about one aspect of this before, right? And this is, of course, the idea that there is a God and that he really is, that if there is a God and he really is in charge of the world, even with all the freedom he gives me to choose and to make my reality, everything that happens is because it's necessary for me to become the person I need to be in order to fulfill my purpose for having been created. And of course, that includes all of my flaws and my challenges and my health issues, right? All of it. And as I've said before, everything I need, I have, and everything I have, I need. And the last part, of course, meaning that I need my flaws and my challenges as well. It also means that if I've been given more than it would appear that I need, then that's meant to be given to someone else who is in need. All right? If God gives you extra, it's because he wants you to do something with that. Okay? that's part of you doing your tafkid in this world. Your purpose for having been created is that you, for some reason, you've been given that extra because you, for some reason, need to give it to someone else. It's not the same as if he just gave them that extra and gave you less. The act of you giving creates something in the world, and it does something to you. All right. So it's often said that when Yaakov and Esav met, and Yaakov brought a tribute to his brother, right? His brother actually refused to accept it because he said, I have more than enough. And we learn, the rabbis teach that this statement of I have more than enough, because Esav, in a different part of that same story, said, I have all that I need. All right, there's a difference, because Esav saying, Yaakov said, I have all that I need. Esav said, I have more than enough, which tells us that instead of helping others with the excess that God had blessed him with, he hoarded his wealth. All right, but there's a completely different aspect to this bracha that we have to look at, and that is that God also gives us our needs. If we feel that we're lacking something, it's because that lack is necessary. Now, sometimes we think we're lacking and we're not. It's because of a lack of emunah, faith in Hashem. And don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming the victim. Sometimes, I've heard it said, if you're not getting healed, it's because you have a lack of faith. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that sometimes when we feel a lack in our life, it's because we're not trusting that God knows what he's doing. All right? When we trust that God knows what he's doing and he's given us even our needs for a reason, then we can channel that feeling into one of trying to grow and to learn what it is that we need to learn from this situation. Every situation in life is an opportunity to learn and to grow, but we have to be on the lookout for it, and we need to be open to it. All right, so that's all I wanted to share on this bracha, this idea that we have everything that we need. God supplies all our needs, but he also gives us our needs. In other words, we have those needs for a reason. They were hand chosen for us. All right. And so then part of our job is to figure out why. And sometimes we do and sometimes we don't, but we have to do the best that we can with it. Okay. So I'm finished for today. If anybody has anything that they want to add or anything that they want to say, please feel free to unmute yourself and to share.
Hi, Penina. Can I ask a question, please?
By all means.
When you were saying about keeping your word to others,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean everybody, Jews and non-Jews?
Absolutely.
Or does it just mean to the Jewish people?
Well, there are two aspects of this concept. The first one is our duty to others. And the truth is that, we have a certain level, Jews have a certain level of duty to other Jews. But the things that we are commanded, and this is something that people make a mistake on, really, is that they think that the laws that have to do with me and others, between people, have to do with the other person. Like, for example, if, I'm told that I'm supposed to give tzedakah, I'm supposed to give charity to others, right? So I think our natural tendency is to think it has to do with this other person. This person's in need, I need to give to help them. What we forget is that the commandment to give tzedakah has nothing to do with them. They're just the facility. It has to do with us and our need to, and our soul's need to give. Same thing with prayer. God doesn't need us to speak to him, right? We pray because of what it does to us inside. So in the same way, even though many of the laws that are given really only apply to Jews to other Jews, for example, the law of Lashon Hara, right? Negative speech. Technically, the law only applies between two Jews. A Jew is not allowed to speak negative speech against another Jew. Now, someone could deduce from that that it's okay to speak Lashon Hara against a non-Jew, okay? But there's another principle involved here, and that is the fact that a person should never speak Lashon Hara, should never speak an untruth, because we create that reality. That has to do with who we are. We should never accustom ourselves to stealing. We should never accustom ourselves to lying. We should never accustom ourselves to speaking negatively because of what it does to our soul. And that the obligation, therefore, is on us, because how we act changes our soul. It changes who we are. So it's a very complicated answer. It doesn't really have, or complicated question that doesn't have an exact answer. But the bottom line is a Jew should never lie to anyone unless the lying will prevent a bigger problem. For example, you're in a public setting and someone asks you something, and if you tell them the truth, it will embarrass somebody else. All right? So then you have to decide, is my lying the greater law, or is my not embarrassing someone the greater law? Sometimes it's permissible to not tell a truth, to tell a lie, if it will save a person's life, if it will keep them from being embarrassed, if it will avoid you speaking Lashon Hara. All right, so it's not black and white. We're not supposed to lie, but sometimes it's more important to preserve another person's dignity than to lie, than to not lie. So it's not, a cut and dried black and white kind of thing. But in general, yes, it applies to Jews as much as non-Jews. I mean, the law applies to the Jew, but the Jew should never speak a lie unless it's because of these special circumstances, regardless of whether the person they're speaking to is Jewish or not. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. But I'll tell you why I asked, because there was something on Sky News about Jewish people in London being victims of hate crime.
Mm-hmm.
And then the comments are, well, Jews are liars. They never tell the truth. They say they do one thing and then they do the other. And, I was just going through all this and I thought, well, surely that as everybody is God's creation and we are representing our faith, and we let our faith down and we let people down and give the haters something to criticize you about.
That's true. Although in what has been my observation and experience is that, if a person comes across a dishonest Jewish person, they will say all Jews are liars. And if they came across 1 out of 1,000, but they want to stereotype, because they hate for no reason. So they're going to find a reason to justify that hate. And so, most Jews are not liars. In fact, most Jews are scrupulously honest. I have found that, and it happens more in Israel, but it also happens in the United States as well. Like if somebody buys something for me, okay, and let's say it was $3.90, right? So I hand them $4. my experience is that most Jews are scrupulous to give back that 10 cents. And we have a custom that if somebody owes you change, but they don't have it at the moment, to just tell them, give it to tzedakah. In other words, because if I say, just keep it, they're always like, no, I can't keep it. I don't owe you. That's stealing. So you say, give it to tzedakah. So then they'll get the change and they'll take the 10 cents and they'll put it in tzedakah. So, I mean, my observation has been that most Jews are very, very honest. Do we have dishonest Jews? Of course we do. We're human. And just like every other human group on earth, you have good and you have bad. The problem is that the haters like to take the one bad example or even the several bad example and say this is representative of everybody, and it's not. You know, and I think that it's people's duty to stand up and say, look, you know, not every black person is violent, not every Arab is a terrorist, not every Jew is a whatever. Yes, there are bad ones, but there are also many good ones. And Judaism certainly does not teach this as a principle. Judaism teaches that we have to honor our word and that we have to speak the truth. Again, occasionally lies are made for one reason or another, and sometimes there are dishonest people, for sure. I mean, we have lots of Orthodox Jews or people who think they're Orthodox sitting in our prisons in Israel. And there's quite a few in the United States as well. That's an unfortunate thing, but that doesn't mean it's okay, and that's not part of our religion.
So to sum it up, it's not all right to lie, as you've just said, unless it's an exceptional circumstance.
Correct.
To lie to anybody.
Correct.
Unless, you know.
Correct. Now, there are some times when somebody feels that it's more justified, let's say, with a non-Jew than with a Jew. And there have been times in the past where, you know, if you don't lie to the non-Jew, you could end up causing another Jew to suffer or be killed. So obviously, every situation has to be taken on its own merit. But in general, no, it's not permissible to lie to a Jew or to a non-Jew, because when we speak an untruth, we are creating that reality of untruth in the world, and we're not supposed to do that. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
Shalom, everyone. Hello.
Hi,
Shalom.
Hello.
Shalom, everyone. We got
Hello.
it? My voice. My question is that the morning Burkhat we are reading, today is 12 Burkhat. We are daily, my kids and my husband and I, 8 Burkhat we are reading regularly.
Okay.
So my question is that today is the 12 Burkhat. So can we add that also?
Can you add what?
Can we add that also 12 Burkhat which we learn today?
Yeah, this is
Can we add this also?
This is part of the morning brachot.
Okay.
Right. If you look in your siddur, okay, so here's siddur, and if I
Yes,
turn
yes.
to during shacharit, during the morning prayers,
Yes.
right. So I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to put it up against the screen. Hang on a second. Okay, after the prayer Elohai Neshama, which is up here, and here, then you have, I think
Okay.
backwards on the screen, but then it starts
Yes.
morning brachot, and we're just making our way through the morning brachot. So the one that we've said now in the Ashkenazi Siddur is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Right, this is number 12.
Yes, yes. This is
Right.
number 12.
Right, and there are 3 more.
3 more. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely. All right, everybody. So unless there are more questions, I'm going to sign off now and say goodbye, good night. It is 11:45 where I live. It's even later for Farah, I think. But everybody should have an amazing week. And I will see you next week. I will let you know. I have to look on the calendar as far as when Tisha B'Av falls for the following week, but I'll see everybody next week. Have a fantastic week. All right.
Both